When pressed by journalists to reveal the document's contents, Dempsey refused, stating, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." Hello! If you haven't seen part 1, go right on back to the other video. The link will be in the little description card in the top right corner of this screen. Watch part 1 and then come back for part 2. If you did watch part 1, I said I would reveal which one I found to be the worst in that first bunch. And now for the answer. Klara Morova. Now I know she came up against a dude who ate 782 people. So some of you may ask, how can you beat that? Well, if you only look at numbers, indeed nobody can. But in a sense, with that dude, you knew what to expect. He did what he did openly, and he didn't eat his own son. Now on to part 2 with, at number 5, none other than the butcher of Rostov, Andrei Chikatilo. So Andrei Chikatilo, also nicknamed the Rostov Ripper, the Red Ripper, was a former school teacher whose career ended as a result of multiple claims of molestation and sexual assault amongst students of both sexes. He went on to find a job as a supply clerk for a factory based in Rostov that required him to travel extensively, which enabled him to become, if not the first, the most prolific serial killer in the Soviet Union, putting a whole population in fear between 1978 and 1990 before finally getting caught. When the police finally caught him, he confessed to the gruesome murder of 56 people, mainly children of both sexes and women. He would typically stab them, sexually assault them, mutilate them, and sometimes cannibalize their private parts and tongues as well. He was found guilty in 1992 and executed with a single gunshot behind his right ear in 1994. He was buried in an unmarked grave at the prison cemetery, which, if you ask me, was a way too easy and way too fast way out for him, considering the unbelievable, unfathomable amount of suffering and pain that he had caused, not only to his victims, but also to their families and close ones. At number 4, we have Albert Fish. Albert Fish was an American serial killer, rapist, and child molester, another one of those, and a cannibal. He was also known as the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, and the Boogeyman. How many nicknames do you need, honestly? He committed a minimum of 3 child murders and a number of other assaults between 1924 and 1928, and certainly before and after that as well. He abducted, raped, and tortured in the most abominable, despicable, revolting ways these children ranging from the age of 4 to 19. He was deeply deranged. He was sadistic as well. He is one of the worst. He has to be one of the worst ones out there. He also then cannibalized some of them and went on to depict his crimes in the most disgusting, filthy, obnoxious, graphic ways possible. So much so that when one of his confessions was made public, the New York Daily Mirror wrote that the disclosure solidified Fish's reputation as the most vicious child slayer in criminal history. Furthermore, Fish's lawyer, James Dempsey, revealed that he was in the possession of his client's final statement, several pages of handwritten notes that Fish apparently penned in the hours just prior to his death. When pressed by journalists to reveal the document's contents, Dempsey refused, stating, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." I unfortunately came across one of his letters to his attorney depicting in gruesome details the worst things of all. I was really physically sick. I strongly advise you don't read anything this freak wrote. It's vile and I couldn't even make it to the end. Fish once boasted that he had children in every state, and at some time stated his number of victims was about 100. However, it is not known exactly what he was referring to, either cannibalization or murder or R-word, nor is it known if his statement was actually truthful. Fish was apprehended on December 13th of 1934 and put on trial for the kidnapping and murder of one of the children. He was convicted and executed by electric chair in 1936 at the age of 65. Once again, considering what he's done, it was way too fast, way too easy for him, but that's just my opinion. Number 3. Richard Chase, also known as the Vampire of Sacramento because he drank the blood of his victims and cannibalized their remains. Richard Trenton Chase was an American serial killer, cannibal, necrophile, who killed 6 people in the span of a month between the end of 1977 and the beginning of 1978 in Sacramento, California. After having been diagnosed with a bunch of mental illnesses at a very early age, and after a handful of very bizarre incidents, all of which involved the blood of one or multiple animals, he was committed into a psychiatric hospital as a schizophrenic suffering from somatic delusions. He's said to have thought that his blood was turning to powder and that he needed the blood of other creatures to replenish his own supply, amongst other things. It's at this time that he got nicknamed Dracula for having killed and drank the blood of birds within the hospital somehow. Richard was eventually released and deemed no longer a danger to others, despite protests by some of the staff that thought he was dangerous. Rightfully so, it appears. After merely a year or so, his mother weaned him off of his prescribed medication herself, deciding that he no longer needed it. She could also have prevented things from escalating had she reported or done anything at all when he later showed up at her door with a dead cat, ripping it open in front of her and smearing his blood and entrails all over his face while screaming. But she did nothing of the sort, and less than a year after that, he began what we could call a murder spree. In 1977, he started with the drive-by shooting of a 51-year-old man, father of 2, who was helping his wife to bring in groceries. He went on to enter people's homes who allegedly had left their doors unlocked and to shoot them at point blank, then stab them, then mutilate their body and engage in necrophilia or cannibalism with the corpses. His victims amounted to 2 women, another 50-year-old man, and 2 little boys, one of which was only 22 months old and whose body he wreaked havoc on. I'm not going to get into the details of any of this as it is too distressing and graphic. After the second murder, the FBI was called in and they compiled a profile of the killer and determined that he would be tall, malnourished, a loner, physically unclean, and that most importantly, he would continue to kill. 5 days after the mass murder of 4 people in the same house, and after hearing the FBI profile a woman allegedly a former school friend of his, whom he had seen and scared with his creepy demeanor a few days before, contacted the police saying she believed Richard Chase could be the killer. The police ran a background check on Chase, where they came across his registration of a .22 caliber pistol, the gun used in the shootings. They went to his apartment, where they found him with the blood-soaked murder weapon and one of his victims' wallets, so they arrested him. While he was in custody, they searched his apartment and found the walls, floors, ceilings, refrigerator, and all of his eating and drinking utensils soaked in blood. On the counter was the blender he used to make his quote-unquote smoothies. It was covered in coagulated blood and rotting bits of organs. Inside the refrigerator, they found several animal and human body parts and organs. A calendar showed the inscription "Today" on the dates of each of the murders. And get this, the same word was written on 44 more dates yet to come during that year. Scary. On the 2nd of January of 1979, the trial began. Chase was charged with 6 counts of murder. On May the 8th, after 5 hours of deliberation, the jury came back with a verdict of 6 counts of first-degree murder. Chase was to die in the gas chamber at San Quentin Penitentiary. In jail, the other inmates taunted him and urged him to kill himself. They did not want him near them. On the day after Christmas of 1980, so roughly 3 years after the killings, he was found dead on his bed in his cell. He had apparently hoarded his treatment pills with the purpose of committing suicide, which he achieved through an overdose. Hang on, guys. We only have 2 more, but the worst is yet to come. At number 2, Nathaniel Bar Jonah. Nathaniel Levi Bar Jonah was an American convicted child molester, serial killer, and suspected cannibal. Yet another one of these. This guy committed his first assault at the age of 7, when he tried to strangle a 5-year-old girl. He was stopped in time, thankfully. At the age of 12, he sexually assaulted a 6-year-old boy and apparently got away with it. At 15, he attempted to murder 2 boys, but couldn't convince them to follow him. Thankfully, again. But at 18, he dressed up as a cop, which would become his MO, and abducted an 8-year-old boy while he was on his way to school. Then he essayed him, beat him, and strangled him almost to death. Miraculously, a neighbor saw the abduction and called the cops. He was caught, still with the boy, who barely made it alive. I'll spare you the details. And yet Bar-Jonah was not locked up. He only got a year's probation, and so he went on to assault a 9-year-old girl, once again dressed up as a cop, and was seen by a witness who notified the authorities. The news of this attack did not reach his probation officer, so he was never charged, and he was released from his parole only a year after the crime, which almost cost the little boy his life, and probably would have had he not been caught by the real cops. He even received a letter thanking him for his cooperation. At 20 years old, he was finally arrested and convicted of attempted murder and received a sentence of 18 to 20 years in prison for having handcuffed, molested, and then tortured 2 boys, leaving one of them for dead after having repeatedly jumped on his chest. And mind you, he was 375 pounds at the time. Once again, miraculously, the boy regained consciousness, managed to find help, and the other boy was found just in time, still alive in the trunk. While in prison, Bar-Jonah was transferred to the state hospital. Later in the same year, a Superior Court judge ruled that Massachusetts had failed to prove that he was dangerous, and he was released. I will let that sink in. Furthermore, during this time, he had confided in his psychiatrist that he fantasized about abducting, murdering, and cannibalizing children. I guess that this was not enough to prove he was dangerous, though. Alrighty then. So at the age of 34, he was back to his old tricks just a month after having been released from the hospital. He saw a 7-year-old boy sitting in a car alone in a parking lot, and so he rushed over to the car and sat on the boy's chest, because that's a thing apparently, right? Some witnesses, along with the boy's mother, saw that and ran to the boy's rescue, causing Fat Jonah to flee. Now, I don't mean to fat shame, but the guy literally used his weight to try to kill somebody, a child, no less. So I think, all right. An officer recognized his description and he was later arrested for the attack. Although he ended up admitting to having intended to kill the boy, he was only sentenced to probation, yet again. In 1996, 5 years later, 10-year-old Zach Ramsey left his apartment to go to school, taking his usual route through an alleyway. Multiple people living there reported seeing Ramsey there that morning, and Bar-Jonah wearing a police-like jacket. Then Ramsey disappeared. While searching Bar-Jonah's apartment, detectives found a list of boys' names, which included previous victims and Zachary Ramsey, followed by the word died. Furthermore, they found dozens of newspaper clippings following the Ramsey case and a bunch of child photo magazine cutouts. A former roommate of Bar-Jonah described finding clothes in his apartment which seemed to match Ramsey's, in addition to bloody gloves. But it's not all. Investigators also found notebooks with coded writing. In them, Bar-Jonah described torturing and eating children. There were macabre recipes involving children's body parts with titles such as Little Boy Pot Pie or French Fried Kid, and phrases such as lunches served on the patio with a roasted child. Can you imagine? He also mentioned serving these recipes to neighbors. Human hair was also found inside a meat grinder of his. It belonged to an African-American male, but not Ramsey. They also found child bone fragments in his garage, with yet another DNA, but still not Ramsey's. Although Bar-Jonah was known to be a voracious eater, financial records show that he had very few grocery store expenses for nearly a month after Ramsey disappeared. He had also begun holding cookouts in which he served burgers, chilies, meat pies, casseroles, etc. When people told him that the meat tasted weird, his response was that he had gone deer hunting and it was deer meat. However, he did not own a rifle or a hunting license, nor had he ever been deer hunting. Detectives were led to believe that he may have been responsible for the abduction, murder, and disappearance of 3 other children. Montana police charged him with kidnapping, sexual assault, and the murder of Zach Ramsey. Zach Ramsey's mother was swayed by Bar-Jonah's defense team to testify for them that she believed her son was still alive, which led jurors to not convict Bar-Jonah for his murder, which blows my mind. During his trial, the now 36-year-old girl whom he had assaulted recognized him. However, the statute of limitations had expired, and so he was not charged with that crime again. That obnoxious monster ended up getting sentenced to 130 years in prison, and he maintained his innocence up until his death of a heart attack in his cell 4 years later only. Once again, significant levels of LDL. At number 1, we have none other than Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, was an American serial killer and offender who murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. Many of his later murders involved necrophilia, cannibalism, and the permanent preservation of body parts, and particularly skulls. At a very young age, Jeffrey started to show interest in bones, animal bones at first, of course, at the time that his parents started the process of getting separated. His father moved out, and his interest for the macabre grew exponentially, as did his consumption of his newfound quote-unquote medication, alcohol. He found refuge in his hobby and started to collect roadkill to dissect and skin the bodies of small animals. He is rumored to have killed a few neighborhood pets himself, all the while self-medicating with alcohol at every hour of the day, even in school. His alcohol consumption is what ultimately kept him from achieving anything in his professional life, at least, as he was said to be smart and very well spoken, but never could reach his potential because of it. A couple of weeks after his high school graduation, his mother left the house with his little brother, sort of abandoning him at his family home, alone at 18 years old. He then committed his first murder, killing a young hitchhiker by strangulation, then dismembering him, stripping the flesh from the bones and smashing the bones into small pieces, then scattering them in the little woods around his house. His father later came home to find him living alone and decided to send him off to the military, where he spent a little time training as a medic and learning a lot. He was discharged for being seen as a violent drunk, and his father sent him to live with his grandmother, the relative that he connected the most with, to try and help him sober up. Unfortunately, that's when he became a frequent visitor of gay bars and bathhouses, which would later lead him to his next 16 kills. Still, 9 years had passed between the first and the second kill, which would happen one night where Dahmer wouldn't even have any recollection of actually beating his victim to death. Or so he said. So he took the body of this boy that he had spent the night with at a hotel to his grandmother's and proceeded to get rid of it the same way he had for the previous one. After that, he would typically bring men back to her house, engage in sexual relations with them, and drug them, strangle them before using acid and crushing force to destroy the remains. Not always in that order. In some cases, he practiced necrophilia before destroying the bodies, mostly trying to preserve the skulls. He ended up getting thrown out by his grandmother for bringing in men at all hours of the night and for the foul smells that sometimes emanated from the basement. Once he got his own place, he let go of the little control he had over his urges, and the murder pace increased significantly. He would still drug them, but to what extent, we don't really know. Sometimes he cannibalized them, sometimes he kept specific body parts. Sometimes he experimented on them alive. Either way, it was terrifying, and he took a lot of pictures. His last victim escaped and was able to call the police, who cuffed and arrested him that very night in sight of the crazy amount of evidence against him all over his apartment. He pleaded guilty but insane on 15 out of those 17 murders, and although he was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, schizotypical personality disorder, and psychotic disorder, he was found to be legally sane at his trial and was sentenced to 15 terms of life imprisonment in 1992. He was later sentenced to a 16th term of life imprisonment for an additional homicide committed in Ohio in 1978, his first murder. But he still had only one life to give. On November the 28th of 1994, so only 2 years later, he was beaten to death by Christopher Scarver, another inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Scarver told the guards that God had told him to do it. Ironic, since Dahmer had supposedly turned to God while in jail. Some rumors suggested that he would have either wanted to avenge the black community, since most of Dahmer's victims were black, or that he would have wanted publicity. We will never know. Anyways, guys, that was a lot to unpack. Let me know in the comments below which one you thought was actually the worst of the worst, and which one or which ones you'd like to see a focused video on. If you appreciated the video, consider giving it a like and subscribing to help the channel grow. And don't forget to ring the bell to be notified whenever I upload a new video. In the meantime, if you want another weird story, check out this short video on infamous killer Gaisha Sara Abe. And I will see you in the next one. Bye!